August 15, 1940. 11:47 a.m. 15,000 feet above the North Sea. Hauptmann Horst Tietzen led a formation of 63 Heinkel He-111 bombers toward the English coast, their target the RAF airfields at Newcastle and beyond. Escorting them were 34 Messerschmitt Bf-110 twin-engine fighters, the Luftwaffe's supposedly invincible Zerstrer destroyers. Tietzen had flown combat missions over Poland, Norway, and France. He understood aerial warfare intimately, and knew that what he was about to face was, in his estimation, a broken, demoralized air force clinging to survival. The intelligence briefings had been clear and consistent. The RAF fighter command was finished. 2 months of sustained attacks had destroyed their airfields, decimated their pilot strength, and shattered their morale. German pilots returning from missions over southern England reported easy victories against pilots who seemed barely trained. The Spitfires and Hurricanes, though modern aircraft, were flown by boys who panicked under pressure and broke formation at the first sign of combat. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring himself had declared that the RAF had perhaps 2 weeks of effective resistance remaining. The invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion, would proceed as planned once air superiority was confirmed. Today's raid, striking targets in northern England that intelligence suggested were lightly defended, would demonstrate German dominance and break whatever spirit the British still possessed. The war would be over by September. Germany would control Europe from the Atlantic to Poland, and pilots like Tietzen would be celebrated as the heroes who had broken Britain's will to fight. What Tietzen couldn't have known, what German intelligence had catastrophically failed to understand, was that nearly every assumption underlying his confidence was wrong. The RAF wasn't broken, they were adapting. British pilots weren't amateurs, they were learning faster than German doctrine could evolve. And the Germans were about to fly into a coordinated defense system so sophisticated that it would turn August 15th into the Luftwaffe's bloodiest day of the entire Battle of Britain. By day's end, 75 German aircraft would be destroyed, hundreds of aircrew killed or captured, and the myth of Luftwaffe invincibility would die over English skis. The story of German arrogance and British resilience begins not on August 15th, but in the spring of 1940, when the Luftwaffe was completing its stunning victories across Western Europe. In 6 weeks, German air power had helped crush France, a nation whose military was considered among the world's finest. French fighter pilots, flying modern aircraft from prepared airfields with years of training, had been swept aside. The Armée de l'Air lost over 1,400 aircraft, many destroyed on the ground, the rest shot down in engagements where German pilots seemed to hold every advantage. The Luftwaffe's success bred justified confidence. Their tactics, developed during the Spanish Civil War and refined in Poland and France, emphasized aggressive offensive action, tight unit coordination, and exploitation of superior training. German pilots averaged over 200 hours of flight time before entering combat. They understood energy management, formation tactics, and how to use their aircraft's strengths while avoiding weaknesses. Most importantly, they had combat experience. Many Luftwaffe pilots had been fighting since 1936 in Spain. They knew how to kill and how to survive. The RAF, by comparison, seemed amateur. British pilots had little combat experience. Their tactics, based on pre-war assumptions about bomber interception, emphasized rigid formation and prescribed attack patterns that German pilots found predictably easy to counter. Early engagements over France had gone poorly for the RAF, with Hurricane and Spitfire squadrons suffering heavy losses against Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters flown by veterans. British morale was reportedly poor, pilots shaken by the speed and ferocity of German attacks. When France surrendered on June 22, 1940, German pilots lounging at newly captured French airfields had every reason for confidence. They had defeated every opponent they'd faced. Britain stood alone, without allies, facing the most powerful military machine in Europe. The English Channel provided temporary protection, but German air superiority would neutralize that advantage. Once the RAF was destroyed, invasion would be straightforward. Most German pilots believed the war would be over within weeks. This confidence manifested in contempt. Luftwaffe pilots, interviewed by propaganda units for German newsreels, described British pilots as schoolboys playing at war and amateurs who would run crying to their mothers when facing real combat. These weren't just propaganda statements. Private letters and diaries from German pilots revealed genuine belief that the RAF was a minor obstacle. Major Adolf Galland, already an ace with multiple victories, wrote to his family that defeating Britain would be easier than France, because the British have no stomach for real fighting. German intelligence reinforced this narrative. Luftwaffe intelligence estimates in July 1940 suggested the RAF had approximately 900 fighters, of which perhaps 675 were operational at any given time. These numbers were roughly accurate, but German analysis concluded that British pilot quality was poor, aircraft production was inadequate to replace losses, and RAF tactics were rigid and outdated. More critically, German intelligence believed British radar was primitive, and that ground-controlled interception was impossible at the scale required for effective defense. Every one of these intelligence assessments was wrong or incomplete. British pilot quality was improving rapidly as the few survivors of France taught hard lessons to new arrivals. Aircraft production, under Lord Beaverbrook's aggressive management, was producing Spitfires and Hurricanes faster than Germany could destroy them. British tactics were evolving, abandoning pre-war formations in favor of flexible responses adapted from observed German methods. And British radar, combined with the world's first integrated air defense system, gave the RAF an advantage that German intelligence had fundamentally failed to understand. The chain-home radar system, operational since 1938, consisted of tall towers along Britain's coast transmitting radio waves and detecting reflections from aircraft up to 100 miles away. This early warning allowed RAF fighters to scramble only when raids were detected, conserving fuel and pilot strength. The Germans knew about chain home. Their intelligence had photographs of the towers, but they dismissed it as ineffective. German radar experts, examining chain home's long wavelength and apparent crudeness, concluded it couldn't provide accurate enough information for fighter direction. This assessment was catastrophically wrong. Chain home wasn't sophisticated by technical standards, but it worked, and more importantly, it was integrated into a command and control system that transformed raw radar data into actionable intelligence. Observer Corps posts tracked aircraft once they crossed the coast. Fighter Command Headquarters at Bentley Priory collected all information, plotted raids on operations room tables, and directed squadrons to intercept. This system allowed outnumbered RAF fighters to be in the right place at the right time, making their numerical disadvantage less critical than German planners assumed. The Germans didn't understand this system because they had nothing comparable. Luftwaffe raids were coordinated by pre-briefing and radio communication, but there was no ground-based system tracking all aircraft and directing them dynamically. German fighters operated independently once airborne, relying on visual observation and pilot initiative. This worked when attacking unprepared opponents, but against an integrated defense system that could vector fighters to intercept incoming raids, German formations were predictably vulnerable. The Battle of Britain began in earnest on July 10, 1940, with German attacks on Channel shipping and coastal targets. These early raids confirmed German assumptions. The RAF responded slowly, their formations were easily scattered, and German fighters consistently achieved favorable exchange ratios. Luftwaffe pilots returning from these missions reported easy victories and demoralized British opposition. Goering, reviewing these reports, concluded that intensified attacks would break fighter command within days. August brought escalation. German attacks shifted to RAF airfields, attempting to destroy fighter command on the ground. The raids were large, sometimes exceeding 300 aircraft, and they inflicted serious damage. Airfields were cratered, hangars destroyed, aircraft caught on the ground and burned. RAF squadrons, constantly engaged and taking heavy losses, seemed near breaking point. German intelligence, monitoring British radio traffic and interrogating captured pilots, concluded the RAF was down to perhaps 300 operational fighters. Victory seemed imminent. But British production and pilot training were replacing losses faster than Germans realized. The RAF that German pilots faced in mid-August was not weaker than in July but stronger, its pilots more experienced, its tactics more sophisticated, and its ground control more effective. The Germans didn't see this because their intelligence system was feeding them information they wanted to hear rather than accurate assessments. Confirmation bias had replaced analysis. August 15, 1940, would be the day this delusion shattered. Goering, impatient with the pace of RAF destruction, ordered maximum effort raids across the entire British coast. The plan was to overwhelm British defenses through sheer numbers, attacking simultaneously in the south, center, and north. British fighters, stretched across multiple engagements, would be unable to respond effectively. The raids would demonstrate German power and break British morale. It was Germany's largest aerial assault of the Battle of Britain, and it would become their most costly defeat. The Northern Raid, led by Hauptmann Tietzen, represented the Luftwaffe's confidence at its peak. Intelligence suggested northern England was lightly defended, with most RAF squadrons committed to defending the south. The 63 bombers and 34 escorting fighters should face minimal opposition. The raid would destroy airfields, factories, and morale while demonstrating that no part of Britain was safe from German attack. The crews were relaxed, almost casual. This would be an easy mission against an opponent already beaten. The first indication something was wrong came at 12:15 p.m., when British fighters appeared far earlier than expected. Not a few scattered aircraft but organized squadrons, attacking from altitude with clear coordination. These weren't the panicked defensive scrambles German pilots had encountered in the south. These were deliberately positioned interceptions, fighters waiting at optimal altitude and attacking with tactical sophistication. The RAF had known they were coming and had prepared accordingly. What Tietzen couldn't have known was that chain-home radar had detected his formation when it was still 90 miles from the English coast. Fighter Command had tracked its approach, calculated its heading and altitude, and scrambled 7 squadrons totaling over 70 fighters to intercept. The British fighters had climbed to altitude, positioned themselves upsun, and waited. When they attacked, they did so with every advantage: altitude, position, surprise, and numerical superiority. The German formation, expecting light opposition, suddenly faced an overwhelming coordinated defense. The Messerschmitt Bf 110 escorts, designed as long-range destroyer fighters, proved catastrophically vulnerable. Against bomber formations they had been effective, using their twin engines' endurance and heavy armament to escort raids deep into enemy territory. But against single-engine fighters like Spitfires and Hurricanes, the Bf 110's size and weight made it unmaneuverable. British fighters, attacking in coordinated pairs, picked off the German escorts with brutal efficiency. Within 15 minutes, 8 Bf 110s were destroyed, the survivors forming defensive circles that left the bombers unprotected. Oberleutnant Johannes Trotloff, flying one of the escorting Bf 110s, later described the engagement in his diary. "We expected scattered opposition, perhaps a few inexperienced pilots we could brush aside. Instead, we found ourselves fighting coordinated squadrons attacking from multiple directions. They knew exactly where we would be and had positioned themselves perfectly. It was like flying into an ambush. The British pilots weren't amateurs. They fought with skill and determination that shocked us. We lost half our formation before reaching the target." The bombers, now effectively unescorted, pressed on toward their targets. British fighters, having scattered the escorts, turned their attention to the Heinkels. The bombers flew tight defensive formations, their gunners creating overlapping fields of fire that German doctrine suggested would protect them from fighter attack. But RAF pilots had learned to attack from angles that minimized exposure to defensive fire, diving through formations at high speed, firing short bursts, then breaking away before gunners could track them effectively. Tietzen's bomber was hit repeatedly, shells from Spitfire cannons punching through the aluminum airframe and damaging hydraulics, controls, and engines. He ordered the bomb load jettisoned and turned for home, but his formation was disintegrating around him. Bombers fell from the sky trailing smoke and fire. Some exploded when fuel tanks ignited. Others spiraled down with dead or wounded pilots unable to control them. The neat formation that had crossed the English coast dissolved into scattered survivors desperately trying to escape. Of the 63 bombers that attacked northern England, 8 were destroyed, and many others damaged too severely to return to service. The 34 escorting fighters lost 8 aircraft, with several others crash-landing in France with battle damage. Total German losses for this single raid exceeded 16 aircraft, with 56 aircrew killed, captured, or missing. And this was just one of multiple raids launched that day, all meeting similar concentrated opposition. In the south, simultaneous raids faced even heavier resistance. German formations attacking airfields near London encountered RAF squadrons that seemed to appear from nowhere, attacking with coordination that suggested detailed knowledge of German approach routes and timing. The claims about British radar being ineffective were clearly wrong. The intelligence about RAF strength being depleted was clearly wrong. The assumptions about British pilot quality being poor were clearly wrong. Everything German planning had been based on was revealed as catastrophically incorrect. Lieutenant Ulrich Steinhilper, a Bf-109 pilot flying in the southern attacks, was shot down and captured on August 15th. In his post-war memoir, he described his realization during that mission. "We'd been told the RAF was finished, down to their last few fighters, but the sky was full of Spitfires and Hurricanes. They weren't flying in the rigid formations we'd seen earlier. They were using flexible tactics, attacking from multiple directions, using their aircraft's advantages intelligently. These weren't defeated pilots clinging to survival. These were professionals who had learned from combat and adapted faster than we realized." The day's total losses shocked Luftwaffe command. 75 German aircraft destroyed, 111 damaged, over 200 aircrew killed or captured. For comparison, the RAF lost 34 aircraft with 13 pilots killed. The exchange ratio, previously favoring Germany, had reversed dramatically. More importantly, the psychological impact was devastating. German pilots who had believed they were facing a broken enemy now understood they were fighting a capable, determined opponent with technological and tactical advantages they hadn't anticipated. Goering's response was to blame subordinates. He accused intelligence officers of providing false information about RAF strength. He criticized fighter pilots for failing to adequately protect bombers. He ordered new tactics emphasizing closer escort and higher altitude approaches. But he couldn't acknowledge the fundamental problem. German strategy had been based on systematic underestimation of British capabilities. Fixing tactics couldn't compensate for strategic delusion. German pilots returning from August 15th missions told different stories than those from earlier raids. The contempt and mockery were gone, replaced by respect and concern. Squadron diaries and personal letters describe British pilots as skilled, determined, and well-coordinated. The word amateur disappeared from German descriptions. Officers who had predicted Britain's collapse within days now estimated weeks or months would be needed to achieve air superiority, if it was possible at all. The integrated air defense system that had defeated the August 15th raids was Britain's decisive advantage. Chain-home radar provided early warning that allowed fighter command to scramble squadrons with sufficient time to climb to altitude. Observer corps posts tracked raids once they crossed the coast, providing continuous position updates. Fighter Command Headquarters at Bentley Priory synthesized this information, directing squadrons to intercept positions where they could attack with altitude and numerical advantage. This system meant RAF fighters were consistently in the right place at the right time, making their numerical inferiority less critical than German planners assumed. The Germans had nothing comparable. Luftwaffe raids relied on pre-mission briefings and hoped for surprise. Once airborne, formations operated independently, unable to be redirected based on changing conditions. If RAF fighters weren't where expected, German bombers might reach targets unopposed. But if fighter command positioned squadrons correctly, German formations flew into prepared ambushes. August 15th proved that British ground control could consistently achieve the latter, making German raids predictably vulnerable. The technological advantage extended beyond radar. British aircraft production, which German intelligence believed was collapsing, was actually exceeding German output. Lord Beaverbrook's Ministry of Aircraft Production had streamlined manufacturing, salvaged repairable aircraft, and prioritized fighter production over all other types. In August 1940, Britain produced 476 fighters. Germany produced 220. The RAF wasn't being worn down by attrition. It was growing stronger while the Luftwaffe consumed irreplaceable resources. Pilot training showed similar disparities. The RAF was producing approximately 200 trained fighter pilots monthly, barely sufficient to replace losses, but enough to maintain squadron strength. German training programs designed for a short war couldn't match this output. More critically, Germany was losing experienced pilots, veterans with hundreds of combat hours whose skills couldn't be quickly replaced. The RAF was losing novices who, while tragic for the individuals, were easier to replace from training programs. The exchange was unsustainable for Germany. The Bf-110's failure on August 15 forced immediate tactical changes. The twin-engine destroyer fighters, designed to escort bombers beyond single-engine fighter range, proved unable to defend themselves against modern single-engine fighters. Subsequent raids required Bf-109 escorts for the Bf-110s that were escorting the bombers, an absurd situation that reduced the number of fighters available for actual bomber protection. The Bf-110 was gradually withdrawn from daylight raids, a tacit admission that German doctrine had been fundamentally flawed. German bomber losses forced similar adaptations. The tight defensive formations that were supposed to protect against fighter attack proved ineffective when British pilots attacked from carefully chosen angles at high speed. German bombers needed fighter escort to survive, but providing adequate escort required more fighters than Germany could commit while maintaining acceptable attrition rates. The mathematics of the campaign were turning decisively against the Luftwaffe. August 15th became known in the Luftwaffe as Black Thursday, a day when illusions died and reality imposed itself with brutal clarity. The confident predictions of imminent victory were quietly forgotten. Officers who had mocked the RAF now spoke respectfully of British capabilities. Pilots who had considered their mission a formality now understood they were in a grinding battle of attrition against an opponent who was adapting and improving faster than German strategy could evolve. The psychological impact on German aircrews was profound. Fighter pilots, previously confident in their superiority, now approached British airspace with caution. Bomber crews requested maximum fighter escort and increasingly dropped bombs short of targets to escape pursuing Spitfires and Hurricanes. Morale, previously high, deteriorated as crews realized the easy victory they'd been promised was a delusion. Victory was possible, but it would require months of sustained combat with casualties far exceeding initial estimates. The British, by contrast, gained confidence from August 15th. The integrated defense system had worked exactly as designed. The investment in radar and ground control, questioned by some as expensive and unproven, had delivered decisive results. RAF pilots, who had spent July and early August defending desperately against what seemed like overwhelming force, now understood they could not just survive but win. The Luftwaffe wasn't invincible. It could be defeated through better tactics, better technology, and better use of limited resources. The strategic implications of August 15th extended beyond the immediate losses. Goering had promised Hitler that the RAF would be destroyed by mid-August, clearing the way for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. That promise was now obviously false. The RAF remained effective and showed no signs of collapse. The invasion date, originally planned for September, would need to be postponed indefinitely. Every week of delay gave Britain more time to prepare defenses, more time to receive aid from America, and more time for weather conditions to deteriorate past the point where amphibious invasion was feasible. Hitler, reviewing reports from August 15th, began questioning whether the invasion was practical. The Kriegsmarine had always been skeptical, arguing that the Royal Navy would decimate any invasion fleet. Now the Luftwaffe, which had promised air superiority would neutralize naval threats, couldn't deliver on that promise. By September, when invasion conditions were optimal, the Battle of Britain had clearly become a stalemate that Germany was gradually losing. Operation Sea Lion was postponed indefinitely, then quietly cancelled, though this wasn't publicly acknowledged. The failure to achieve air superiority over Britain had cascading strategic consequences. Germany couldn't invade Britain, which remained a threat in the West while Germany contemplated operations against the Soviet Union. Britain became a base for American forces when the United States entered the war. British bombers struck German cities and industries, forcing Germany to divert resources to air defense. The quick victory over Britain that German strategy assumed would happen instead became a multi-year campaign that Germany could never win, but couldn't afford to abandon. The lessons of August 15th should have been obvious. Never underestimate your enemy, respect their capabilities, and ensure your intelligence accurately reflects reality rather than confirming biases. But institutions rarely learn from defeats quickly enough to matter. The Luftwaffe continued attacking Britain through September and October with diminishing returns. The Blitz, the nighttime bombing campaign against British cities, represented an admission that daylight raids were unsustainable. By switching to night bombing, Germany acknowledged it couldn't achieve air superiority in contested daylight skies. The RAF pilots who defended Britain on August 15th and throughout that summer were celebrated as the few, Churchill's famous phrase honoring their crucial role. But the few fought within a system that multiplied their effectiveness through technology and organization. Individual RAF pilots weren't superior to Luftwaffe veterans. Indeed, many British pilots were less experienced. But British pilots fought within an integrated air defense system that positioned them advantageously, while German pilots attacked without comparable support. Systemic advantages trumped individual skill. This lesson has repeated throughout military history. Technologically inferior forces fighting within superior systems often defeat technically superior forces lacking organizational advantages. Vietnam demonstrated this when American air power, vastly superior technically, struggled against integrated North Vietnamese air defenses. Desert Storm showed the reverse when American forces combined technological superiority with systematic integration to achieve overwhelming victory. The Battle of Britain was an early example of a principle that remains relevant. Wars are won by systems, not just weapons. German veterans, interviewed after the war, consistently identified August 15th as the day they understood Britain wouldn't be easily defeated. Adolf Galland, who became one of Germany's top aces, wrote in his memoirs that August 15th destroyed the illusion that we faced an inferior opponent. The British proved they could fight effectively, use their technology intelligently, and adapt faster than we could overwhelm them. From that day forward, we knew the Battle of Britain would be long, costly, and might not be winnable. The contempt and mockery that characterized early German attitudes toward the RAF disappeared after August 15th, replaced by grudging respect. British pilots were no longer described as amateurs or schoolboys, but as worthy opponents who fought skillfully within an effective defense system. This change in attitude, documented in German letters, diaries, and official reports, marked a fundamental shift in German understanding of their strategic situation. The intelligence failures that contributed to German overconfidence in August 1940 illustrate the dangers of confirmation bias in military planning. German intelligence officers, under pressure to provide assessments supporting planned operations, delivered optimistic estimates that commanders wanted to hear rather than accurate analyses that might question strategic assumptions. When evidence contradicted the preferred narrative, such as reports suggesting British radar was more effective than assumed, it was dismissed or ignored. This created a feedback loop where planning was based on false premises that weren't corrected until combat revealed their errors. Modern military intelligence emphasizes challenging assumptions and seeking disconfirming evidence, specifically to avoid the failures that plagued German intelligence in 1940. Intelligence analysis today incorporates structured techniques designed to identify and question biases. But the fundamental challenge remains. Providing accurate assessments that might contradict preferred strategies requires institutional cultures that value truth over confirmation. Germany in 1940 lacked such a culture and paid the price in August skis over Britain. The technological surprise of effective British radar and integrated air defense demonstrates the importance of understanding opponent capabilities rather than assuming inferiority. German engineers, examining Chain Home's technical specifications, concluded it was primitive and ineffective. What they missed was that effectiveness depended not on technical sophistication, but on systematic integration and operational employment. Chain Home worked well enough, and the system using its data worked very well, making technical limitations irrelevant. German focus on technical specifications rather than operational capabilities was a critical intelligence failure. The pilot quality question illustrated similar misunderstanding. German assessments focused on individual pilot training hours and experience, concluding that British pilots were inferior because they averaged fewer flight hours. But pilot effectiveness depends on training quality, tactics, and how pilots are employed. British pilots, fighting within a system that positioned them advantageously and taught tactics adapted from combat experience, were more effective than their individual training hours suggested. German pilots, with more training but lacking comparable systematic support, couldn't leverage their advantages effectively. The August 15th raids marked the high point of German offensive capability in the Battle of Britain. Subsequent raids never matched that day's scale or ambition. Losses were unsustainable, and strategies shifted toward survivable but less effective approaches. The campaign continued through September and October, gradually morphing from daylight precision raids into night bombing that was less accurate but safer for German crews. By November, the Battle of Britain was effectively over, with Germany having failed to achieve air superiority and Britain having survived to fight on. The long-term consequences of Germany's failure over Britain were catastrophic for German strategy. The quick Western victory that was supposed to free Germany for operations elsewhere instead became a grinding stalemate consuming resources indefinitely. Britain remained a threat, required forces for defense, and became a platform for Allied bombing campaigns and eventual invasion. The strategic situation Germany faced in 1944, fighting on multiple fronts with insufficient resources, traced directly to the failure to defeat Britain in 1940. Could Germany have won the Battle of Britain? Military historians debate this question, but most conclude that given the actual capabilities of both sides, German victory was unlikely. The integrated British air defense system, superior British fighter production, and British determination to resist created conditions where Germany would have needed overwhelming force sustained over months to achieve air superiority. Germany lacked the resources for such a campaign while also preparing for eventual operations against the Soviet Union. The failure was strategic, not just tactical. The arrogance that characterized German attitudes in July and early August 1940 was based on genuine success in previous campaigns. But success against different opponents in different circumstances doesn't guarantee success in new conditions. The RAF wasn't the Armée de l'Air. Britain's situation wasn't France's. The Channel wasn't the Rhine. German failure to recognize these differences, to accurately assess British capabilities, and to adapt strategy when assumptions proved false, turned what seemed like an easy victory into a costly defeat that changed the trajectory of the entire war. August 15, 1940, the day Luftwaffe pilots expected to demonstrate their dominance, instead became the day their illusions died. 75 aircraft lost, hundreds of crew casualties, and most importantly, the psychological understanding that they weren't facing beaten amateurs but capable professionals fighting within a sophisticated defense system. The contempt turned to respect, the confidence turned to caution, and the expectation of quick victory turned to realization of protracted struggle. Black Thursday earned its name not just from the losses, but from the death of German illusions about easy conquest. The RAF pilots who fought that day, and throughout that summer, saved Britain from invasion and kept alive the possibility of eventual Allied victory. They didn't do it alone. They fought within a system that multiplied their effectiveness through technology and organization. But their courage and skill, combined with that system, defeated an opponent who had seemed invincible just weeks earlier. The lesson remains relevant today. Underestimating your enemy, assuming technological or tactical superiority without evidence, and believing your own propaganda are paths to defeat regardless of how capable your forces might be individually. The Luftwaffe pilots who called the RAF amateurs in July 1940 learned by August that contempt for your enemy is the first step toward defeat. The 60 aircraft lost on August 15th were just part of the price for that lesson. The real cost was the strategic failure that followed. The canceled invasion, the multi-year bombing campaign that consumed resources without achieving objectives, and ultimately the defeat of Germany by an alliance that Britain's survival made possible. All because German pilots believed their own propaganda, until British pilots taught them otherwise in the skies over England on one bloody August day in 1940.